Welcome to the Studio Chat podcast, the podcast designed to be your companion in the journey of self-discovery. I'm Barbara Thompson, your host, and a dedicated therapist. I'm the founder and owner of Self-Care Studio, a private counselling practice. With my clients, in courses that I create, on this podcast, I'm committed to ensuring that you have the support that you need. I created this podcast as a space for you to feel a sense of connection and a reminder that you're not alone in this thing that we call life, this adventure. This podcast is your weekly reminder to trust yourself, live life authentically, and embrace the path that is uniquely yours. Together, we'll explore ways to break free from people-pleasing, overthinking, allowing you to claim your time and energy to live life on your terms. You'll be joined by myself as I take you through some episodes, or during the year, I'll have some special self-care experts as guests on my podcast. So if you're ready to step into a life that's truly for you, join me on this journey. Let's navigate the twists and turns of life together, and more importantly, live your life for you. So thank you so much for choosing to spend some time with me today. Let the Studio Chat begin. Welcome back to another episode of the Studio Chat podcast. It's so nice to have you here. And today we're going to be talking about something that I think a lot of us can relate to in our lives, whether we were kids or teenagers or as adults or as we become parents ourselves. This topic of food addiction, I really believe it's not spoken enough about. There's not enough awareness about food addiction. Food is something we need to survive. So it's something that we can't not have in our lives. And it's really important to have a healthy relationship. So I'd love to welcome Vanessa Kredler to my podcast. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And like I said earlier to you, Barbara, I think it's great that you're doing this podcast. So thank you for having me.
Oh, it's really nice. If you can hear a squeaking, it is my dog, my puppy with a toy. It's so funny. I've got my cat watching me and I've got my puppy deciding to all of a sudden, as soon as we hit record, she's playing with a toy, so I might go get that off her in a second. Let's just jump straight into it. So could you please help us define what food addiction is, Vanessa?
Yeah, well, that in itself is quite a topic. So, yes, so ultimately, I love Gabor Mate's definition overall of addiction. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a well-known addiction specialist from Canada, also identifies as somebody with addiction himself. So he says, addiction is any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure and relief in and therefore craves, but is unable to give up despite negative consequences. So if we then translate that to food, it's, essentially we are overeating, we're binging, we're using food. We know that it's got negative consequences, but we can't stop. And what's really important to note about the definition is that there isn't actually an official definition because it's not officially recognized as a thing, right? So basically, you hear people talk about it all the time, right? I'm addicted. I feel like I've got food addiction. But it's not in any of the manuals that the health professionals use to diagnose. So, for example, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases. So it's not on there. But what's exciting is that there was just a few weeks ago the first conference on reaching a consensus on what it should actually be called as a concept so that we can apply to get it into those manuals. And so going back to your question about how do you define it, it has actually been decided amongst these professionals who were at the conference that it should be called ultra-processed food addiction. And so, it's kind of probably quite obvious why, because we know that those ultra-processed foods, foods that are high in sugar, high in fat, high in salt, refined carbohydrates, those types of foods are highly addictive to people. even though there are people, professionals, including myself, I would really put myself into that category, where we say, well, people can be addicted to other types of foods. They don't always have to be ultra processed. And you can be, addicted to the process of eating itself. However, for the purpose of getting ultra processed food addiction recognized, it's best to have that label to put it into those diagnostic manuals, because if we do, then that means we can do more research, we've got more treatment avenues, it's more recognized, right? So that sort of goes to your question around how do you define it? What is it?
Yeah, a lot of people can relate to it. I think a lot of people take blame, especially with binge eating or overeating, people eat. Food in a lot of cultures is celebration. It's, when good things happen in our life. And then in the movies, it's been heavily documented that when you get dumped by your partner, you sit on the couch with a massive pint of ice cream and you or box of chocolates and cry into them. So it's interesting that when we think of food addiction, it's something that I think a lot of us will blame, and me included at some points in my lives. I think, what's wrong with me? Like, why do I open a packet of Tim Tams? I can't just have, and this is me, and I own this. I'm not the person that I'll open a packet of lollies I'm more of a chocolate person. So sometimes, again, when we look at food addiction, sometimes it's savory, sometimes it's sweet, sometimes it's both. But for me, if anyone's listening to this and you can relate to me, welcome to the club. The more we talk about it, the more we bring awareness about it. If I open a packet of Tim Tams, within that 24 hours, majority of the pack will be gone, or all the pack will be gone, because I'll just have a couple with my coffee or tea, and then I'll go around and go, oh, I'll just have one more. I'll just have one more. And then I'm like, oh my God, what's wrong? Like, literally, I know within me, like, what's wrong with me? Why can I not stop eating this thing?
Absolutely.
So I'm interested to know, because you're the expert in this field, and I've wanted to ask this, question to you, Vanessa, is why is this addiction so different to all the other addictions?
Well, it's interesting because it's not that different, right? So there are definitely similarities. There have been studies that show that, when people consume ultra-processed food, particularly sugary foods, that the same areas of the brain light up than if they were consuming any sort of other drug, like, say, for example, cocaine, right? So these studies do exist. So in that sense, we know that ultra-processed food can activate the same reward centers in the brain than other drugs do. So in that regard, it's not really that different from other addictions. But the way it is different is that recovery is a lot more nuanced, a lot more kind of difficult, because you can't abstain from, say, food as well as you could from, say, cocaine or alcohol, right? It's just an entirely different ballgame. You have to learn how to live with your drug of choice, so to speak, and learn how to eat in a way that works for you, right? So it's a little bit different for everyone, and that's what makes it very difficult. Also, what makes it difficult, of course, is that, again, you have to consume it, so you can't entirely stay away from it. You can't avoid the places where you will find it. Like, you have to go shopping in the supermarket. You have to go and get your food, right? So there's no avoiding it in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah. So you look at gambling, sex, drugs, shopping, like any addiction.
Yeah.
I think our human body needs some form of food to survive. So I can understand any of the other addicts in those areas. Yes, it's very hard to give, and it's very hard, but I think food is, you kind of do need to eat something to live and to survive. I'd love to also know, do you come across any common misconceptions when it comes to when people talk about food addictions?
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest misconception that I would want to mention here is that it doesn't exist. So it's actually quite a controversial construct in some fields. So, for example, in the field of eating disorders professionals, and again, the argument is sort of along the lines of, well, we need food to survive. So everybody, is kind of addicted to food because we need it, right? And also, some researchers say, well, with drugs such as, again, I'm going to use the example of cocaine, let's say, right? The dopamine reward system of the brain really lights up very quickly. With food, it's a little bit more subtle, right? Also, with addictive substances such as alcohol, that it's the ethanol in the alcohol that's the addictive substance. In the tobacco, it's nicotine. So with food, it's a lot more gray. It's much more difficult. However, of course, we know, as we've just, already discussed, right? We both have experience with it. And there are a lot of people who do identify with it, even also in study. There was a study not too long ago on people with binge eating disorder who describe it as an addiction, right? They describe their binge eating as an addiction. And we know it's an addiction also because it manifests as an increase in tolerance over time. There are withdrawal symptoms and cravings, and so these are all hallmarks of addiction. So I think the biggest misconception of all is that it doesn't exist, but I do hope that with the increasing evidence, of which there is now quite a big evidence base, I would say, I hope that it will now be recognized, and this misconception will be decreased.
And I love how you've really, in the early part of this episode, you've brought up the ultra processed side of things, because when you think about it, a lot of us are eating way more food than we ever have, but we're so depleted in nutrients. So if people think about that for a moment, I always like to say, go back to the caveman days, because at the moment you think of what you're eating within a day. Again, we're not talking about calorie restrict, diets or being on a calorie deficit or anything like that, just eating generally. We eat a lot more than what our ancestors did. But if you look at your plate, how many things come out of a packet? And there's no right or wrong here, but it's just your body will eat something, and especially the ultra-processed stuff that has been made in a lab or made in a petri dish to get your, that bliss spot. So we get it. So they make money and we get addicted to it. So I think that's a really, tough thing for us to kind of get our heads around, is like we're eating food, but the construct of food itself, even gluten or even the way our food is made, is completely different to what it used to be in the 1980s and previously. So people are like, oh, my grandma ate it, or my family's always eaten it. But the education out there, just the awareness of having these conversations of our food has changed.
Absolutely. And, I think we need to recognize that it really is a big industry nowadays. And I think a lot of what we say is food is actually not really food anymore. It's almost like it's just edible substances, because food really, right, is fresh vegetables and fruit and meat and dairy and whatnot, right? And so of course, dairy, okay, it's processed, right? But it's not as processed as ultra processed foods, which are, as you say, made in labs. And yes, there is such a thing as a bliss point where, researchers really look at, well, what is the optimal point at which people love the product so much that they will come back for more. And this is well documented that this exists as a way to make these things highly palatable and addictive.
And I think anyone, again, I'm just speaking from my experience too, there's been many times in my life, or many days. Today is a really wet, rainy, horrible day. If you think, okay, the story we tell ourselves every Monday swings around, or every week or every month or before every occasion, okay, I've got 3 months before this, or I've got 6 months, I'm going to clean up my food, or I'm going to be good. How many of you listening to this have spent all day thinking about your favorite thing, or the thing that you think that you're addicted to? So, oh my God, I really want KFC hot chips with the extra seasoning. oh, the seasoning. Oh, no, 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 no. And like almost every hour you think about it, and the next minute you're in the drive-through and then you're having it and you're like, oh no. But that thought consumes you. Like, I know it's just, you cannot think of anything else about. Now everyone listening to this is gonna be like, thanks, Barbara. Now I just want hot chips with chicken salt on it.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And, as you say that, I'm so, so glad that I can say I no longer have this at all. I have no more dialogue or internal obsessions and preoccupations around food because I'm in food addiction recovery. But, it's a big, big journey, and it absolutely consumed me so much. I literally thought I was going to go insane. It was so painful. So absolutely, it's kind of like, people have it to lesser or greater degrees, but when it gets really, really bad, it gets all consuming and it's just so distressing. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for actually, not many people when they work in the industry or were a therapist will actually really disclose that, hey, I've been through this. And the word that you use is painful. It's painful. It controls your life. It consumes you. It's, yeah, I'm really sorry if anyone's listening to this. Like, we're with you, and this is why we're doing this episode. So if anyone's listening to this, I know it's all different for everybody, but what you see and what you've been through too, are there any signs or symptoms that we can look out for that we think, oh, we might be addicted to food?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, first of all, when people are listening, they probably already have a sense, right? It's very common for people to sort of know there's something not right with their relationship with food. And I would say, a really clear sign is we can't control our compulsion to eat, and we continue eating despite negative consequences, right? So we sort of say to ourselves, oh, I'm not going to do this, but we can't control it. We just keep going back for more. Also, we will be experiencing cravings, tolerance, and withdrawal, right? So, I'm craving certain foods and I go back for more. And then over time, I develop a tolerance. I need more and more and more. And then when I try to withdraw, I get headaches, I get tired, I get irritated, all sorts of things. So there's a real kind of, addiction at play. Also, I think a lot of people experience a huge amount of shame and guilt and self-contempt. And I think you've alluded to that earlier as well, that sort of thought of, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? Why have I done it? And there's a huge amount of shame, which just gets worse and worse and worse the more that, the more it escalates. And then I'd also say, there is a strong preoccupation or obsession with food, that constantly thinking about food. And then, of course, if we're eating a lot, then, the concern about weight, concern about body image, all of those things start playing in too. And people can actually develop eating disorders because of an underlying food addiction, right? That is very common. It can also be the other way around, right? There's no doubt. But certainly, it's not uncommon for people to just always want to have more and more and more. And for that reason, they then develop compensation behaviors such as purging or starving themselves or whatnot, right? So this is where the eating disorder and food addiction kind of, diagnoses, if you want to call it that, right, are sort of overlapping as conditions, and it's very intricate, yeah. And then, of course, also in terms of, the signs and symptoms too, social isolation is a big one, because most people will binge on their own because they are really quite ashamed of, doing this. They might start in a social context, but then they'll go off and they'll have a really proper big binge with, behind closed curtains, so to speak. And, if it gets really extreme, you can have all sorts of compounding issues like, financial. I mean, it's expensive, right? It's an expensive addiction. Also, job loss, it's also a time-consuming addiction to procure your food, to, consume it behind closed doors, then to, get rid of the evidence if you live with other people or whatever, and then, compensate. So, do you go to the gym? Do you, whatever it is that you do, right? People have different sort of strategies. And all of that is just an extremely time-consuming thing to be doing. And the more it escalates, the more, you can get then compounding issues with your relationships or with your jobs or, financially. But then also, of course, obesity, related illnesses, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, those are just some of the examples. So there's a huge amount of signs and symptoms and consequences. And then the last one I'll mention is just the, comorbidities such as depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation even, right? So it can get very, very serious.
A lot of it is shame and done when no one knows. So it's all, it's kind of done on the quiet. And I think that's the hardest thing, is people will never really share. But I do want to also mention something, that just because people have food addiction, it can be in smaller bodies too. It doesn't have to be people that are in bigger bodies. And when you mentioned the health conditions, I just want to make people aware that just because someone's in a smaller body, they could be suffering from a relationship with their food and how they eat. And then that can show up with the different health effects as well.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you raised that. Yes, absolutely. Not everybody who has food addiction by far is of a higher weight. Absolutely not, right? So this is why it's so tricky as well, because it's so invisible, and so we suffer in silence, right? Everybody thinks we're totally fine, we look fine, nobody would assume that there's anything wrong with us, but we just really, really struggle on a daily basis. I see that so much, and that was my experience too.
Yeah, and I think you did touch on it when we talk about food addiction with our emotions and our mental health.
Mm.
I really believe, I know from my own personal state too, that the food cravings and our eating habits are really can be influenced with our emotional state and stress.
Yeah, 100%. What I see is, well, it's complex, right? So first of all, what I see is a lot of comorbidities, right? So when somebody presents with a food addiction at a sort of more higher end of the scale, if you like, then often there is anxiety or depression or PTSD or something there, right, as well. And so those conditions already indicate that somebody has difficulties with their emotions, with being able to regulate. They might find they have a dysregulated nervous system. And so what often I see clinically is people use food to regulate, right? This is what, and even with other addictions, mostly addiction is about some sort of attempt to regulate through external substances, right? Whatever it is, or processes, even if it's not a substance. And so it's always about emotions and physiological states or nervous system states. And so that's one side of the emotional piece. But then also on top of it, because of the kind of, escalating behaviors, we become so distraught and so ashamed that then puts another emotional layer of distress onto things. So it's a complex landscape in terms of, emotion, stress, and mental health in relation to food addiction.
When we talk about emotional regulation, and do you hear this in your clinic a lot when people explain, I'll open the packet or I'll open the bag or I'll do this, and they have a handful or they'll have a few, whatever their thing is, and then you kind of almost like have an outer body experience. You black out, you literally are not there, and you only come back in the room or almost come back in your body when you touch the packet. Because most of the time you're doing it when you're doing something else. I mean, sometimes people will just sit, again, everyone's different. Sometimes I know that especially from my background, being in the bodybuilding community, I'm aware. I've seen my partner do it. I've seen people do it where they sit on their kitchen floor with their hands and they're actually going into the peanut butter jar or Nutella jar or Biscoff or like whatever. And literally, like I've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm more of a one that I would eat something and then I would go black out or I would go somewhere else. And then when I touch the packet to eat it, I'd be like, oh my God, it's all gone. And
Yeah.
So is that kind of a common thing you hear in your clinic?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a type of dissociation, basically, right? It's a dissociative strategy, if you like, right? It's just something that, helps us to escape. Addiction, it's sort of like a flight response, so to speak, right? So we escape, we want to get away from something, away from emotional pain or discomfort and towards pleasure, right? That's where we want to go. So yes, absolutely. So it's so common for people to say, I mean, this is how people usually come in, when they start counseling with me is, I just have absolutely no control over this. I don't know what happens. Like next thing I know, I'm in the fridge and here I am, and then the packet is empty. So I hear this all the time. Yeah.
I want to normalize it. That's why
Mhm.
that's why I'm just spending a bit of extra time explaining like
Yeah.
what I've seen and what I've been through. So hopefully someone listening to this is like, oh yeah, that's me. Or
Uh-huh.
I know someone that does that.
Yeah.
And trying to normalize this. What do you think the role of food marketing and the availability of food now, like with Uber Eats and menu log and all that stuff,
Mm.
how does that play in the issue with our food addiction?
Oh God, it's huge, right? The environment is huge, right? I mean, the environment plays a huge role in determining how an addiction kind of goes or not, right? And I don't know if you've heard of the book Dopamine Nation by Anna Lemke. It's a great book, which I highly recommend to anyone listening. So she's a psychiatrist, I don't know, Stanford University or one of those great ones. And this book basically, so she basically says that even for people who don't have a predisposition to addiction, it's so easy to become addicted in today's day and age because, first of all of our foods are created to be hyper palatable. And then, yes, you've got this whole environment where basically it's at your fingertips, it's in excess, you can access it anywhere. And in fact, it's harder to access healthy food than it is to access the sort of, processed stuff that you can order at Uber Eats. So I would say it's a massive, massive contributor is our food environment and the marketing of it. And, it's interesting because in the food addiction world, we predict, right, that we hope at least that we're going to go the same way that we did as a society with tobacco, right? So that, decades ago, it was totally normal to smoke. Everybody was doing it everywhere and anywhere, but now it's pretty regulated. And we would hope that we will go the same way with ultra-processed food, but we're totally not there yet.
Food's tricky too, because when you think about the availability, accessibility, the marketing of it, I've got a marketing background too, and I even fall for the tricks. You don't know what you don't know. So say if someone is, okay, I really want to eat for my body, I want to eat for my health. It's really hard because people can go out and buy a salad or go buy something with the dressing or something in the salad, and you may as well just go have may as well just go have Pizza Hut or something because sometimes just because you're having the salad, the ingredients in there, they sneak the sugary sauces and the thing. So then when you're finished, you've got to have something sweet after. And then you have something sweet after, and then you go, oh, I've got to have this. So there's a couple of things in there. The first thing is the food, even if you want to eat healthier, it can be masked. So it can bring addiction on that way. But then also when you eat something healthier, you sometimes feel like I've got to finish with something with sweet. I've got to finish something sweet.
Yeah, that's very true because the whole culture is that we expect to have a treat. We expect to have dessert. I mean, people like 200 years ago didn't have dessert, right? Maybe here and there, like once a year or something, right? But nowadays it's just normal. So it's the whole sort of culture that plays into this. And it's funny when you were talking about marketing, I remembered that. So I've grown up in Germany. And because, I've always been sensitized to food anyway as a kid, because I've had this forever. Like I've always had a food addiction. And I remember still to the day, like advertisements that I listened to or saw on TV as a kid, like all the songs and everything, and they're all about food, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, look, McDonald's does it best, don't they? I think I remember my parents telling me the story, and they were quite proud of it, which again, in the 80s, I would have my birthday parties always at McDonald's.
Mhm.
And I
Wow.
remember, I think when what was it? Yeah, that's right. I went past, and I've got a younger sister who's 12 years younger than me, and I actually saw it happen to her too. You go past McDonald's and you see the golden arches, and I think I would say, Donald, Donald. And I think my sister said the same, like Ronald McDonald, Donald, and then like pointing, like, how clever is that marketing? Seeing those golden arches and Donald. Like that is like, that's something that's very,
Yeah.
wow. How, look at that.
Absolutely. And another thing that is really quite popular now is, like, how people go on keto diets and all sorts of, low carb or whatever. And so then you see the ads for like keto ice cream, or like, I don't know, these bliss balls and whatnot, all these things. But, it's just another form of junk, really. Right. And it's very easy to binge on that stuff just as much as it is to binge on McDonald's.
Yeah, I actually want to share a real life example from me, if that's okay.
Sure.
A few years ago, when I was dieting for a bodybuilding competition, and I was allowed one meal off a week, and I was working in the gym, so I had a fridge and what do you call it, a freezer behind me when I was in the counter all day of protein ice cream.
Mm.
So I could still have it because it could still fit my numbers or whatever you wanted to do. And I was like, I'll give it a go. And I remember eating this protein ice cream. Like, I'm not really an ice cream person, but it was naughty and it was okay. Now I knew that window, once I finished that window, I could not eat anything for the whole week. I have never had so many cravings and demeaning thoughts about myself. And I didn't cheat because the whole time I was just so strict. The whole time I was dieting for that comp, I didn't waver because I couldn't. I was wearing a bikini in front of people. Oh my God. And if anyone knows me, yeah, I had to make sure that I wasn't going to cheat. But I wanted to share this with someone that most people would see the protein ice cream and be like, wow, great. It fits in with my macros. It's great. But I was so aware of my food. And actually, to be honest, I was eating really no processed foods.
Mm-hmm.
Eating a lot of protein, a lot of vegetables. That was kind of it. But there wasn't much processed stuff happening in that diet.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember having that ice cream, and for 3 days, I was like, my brain was like, go on, just have another one. Or go on. You know what? Just have a Mars bar or have a Snickers bar. Just have one. This is my brain. And then you just do extra cardio. And literally there was this inner voice and it's like, go on. And it would go on for 3 days because I had protein ice cream.
Amazing.
There's only my story I wanted to share. So just because it's happened to me doesn't mean that someone else, it happens to everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's tricky, isn't it? Because in food addiction recovery, and the way that we would treat it, and there isn't yet any evidence base for treatment, but we sort of know what works, given that people do recover. We know this through 12-step programs. We know this through sort of coaching communities and professionals who are working in the field. That it can be helpful to abstain from those particular foods that we crave. However, I also want to stress that for anyone who's listening, it is very sensitive also, right? So in the addictions world, we often talk about the concept of abstinence and also harm reduction, right? So we sort of reduce our exposure to the food. But often, not for everyone, but often the goal is abstaining, because we know that we just can't navigate moderating those foods in any sort of way, right? Some people can, though. So it's really important to know that you've got to trial and error and know what's best for you. But one of the things that is really important to note is that concept is it's not so much about dieting at all, really, right? It's not, we don't want to diet. We want to have food plans which are discerning for us, what we eat that is healthy for us and that is really good and doesn't cause us any cravings or any issues. So we're not trying to restrict in that sense, right? Because as soon as we use the word dieting or restricting, it can be very tricky with people, particularly who struggle with eating disorders, right? And we don't want to go down that route or encourage that whatsoever. So we've got to be very careful, but at the same time, be very aware that for some people, it can be important to abstain from those things because, as you were mentioning with that ice cream, right? It's like when you get hooked on something like that, the brain doesn't let up until you actually remove it. Was that your experience?
Yeah, I never had it again.
Yeah. Okay. I wondered.
Yeah, never touched it, never will touch it. I'll have normal ice cream
Yeah.
and it doesn't do much for me at all. Not bothered.
Interesting.
But that ice cream, I just remember that voice inside my head was just this demon. Like it was so loud. And I was just like, shut up.
Yeah.
Because obviously I was on I was like not eating too much anyway. So I was already battling,
Yeah.
I've always had food, not so much of a healthy relationship with food, and it was always tied to my body image. So that's my story. And so for me, that's why I educated myself about nutrition, because I was sick of it having more power over me. I was like, actually, I want to learn about this stuff for myself.
Yeah.
So I can lean into it rather than always being scared of it and always having other people tell me what's better for I wanted to learn what was good for my body. I have heard another approach. I don't think it's a treatment approach that is specifically for food addiction, but it is to do with relationships with food. I know that there are some programs out there that say if I had this fascination with pizza, just say for keep a diary, but eat pizza for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for a week. Just give yourself 7 days and eat as much of it, like actually fully lean into it and go, you know what, I'm going to have pizza, breakfast, lunch, morning tea, dinner, 2 o'clock all the time. And I have heard that some, it goes the other way. They get to a point where they're like, I actually need some broccoli. Like it's got no power over me because there's enough out there, because sometimes it comes from lack. Oh my God, it might come from growing up in a household where you can't leave the dinner table unless you eat all your dinner.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. So it really depends on where you're coming from, right? So it's like, and again, it goes back to my sort of point around, is it food addiction? Is it eating disorders? What's what? And it's so delicate, right? Because sometimes you get a person who has grown up in a very restricted environment where, it's all about healthy food and you can't have this and you can't have that. And then people develop a food addiction because they're like, now I'm going to go off and get it, right? Because I was never allowed. And so they have this inner rebel almost that sort of just takes over. And so, yes, that's a way that you can develop a food addiction. At the same time, often it's also the other way around, that you've always had some sort of a thing with food, like, an addictive sort of, tendency towards food and maybe even other substances. And then, it's like at some point then it becomes necessary to restrict. And again, I'm using the word restrict, but really it's not the right word, because it's kind of like restriction has such a limiting kind of connotation, and it's more about discerning, right? Knowing what is it that is actually good for me, and knowing I just can't handle this substance. Like for me, for example, so yes, I have experience with food addiction, but similar with alcohol, I just cannot handle alcohol in moderation. I can't do it. So as soon as I realized that, I stayed away from it, because I know that I have, this sort of addictive sort of these tendencies. And so, yes, sometimes, just to going to that point about, where are you coming from, right? Are you coming from a restrictive background, or, what came first kind of thing?
It's so interesting. And thank you again for just bringing up your personal experience, because we are all so different. So for me, I have no alcohol in the house, never do. And if I do, I'll have one or two. So for my brain, I'm like, well, I know I don't have an addictive personality really. So I'm not addicted to alcohol or anything, but why am I addicted? Why does food have this power over me? And that was something that I kept questioning myself, because sometimes, you do, when I talk to people, I'd find out, they used to be this, they do this or this, and now they've moved to food. Like it's just a kind of a spiral that a lot of alcoholics and people that are in AA and stuff, like, I mean, I'm talking of alcoholics, not talking about people that have a few drinks and then don't want to drink anymore. It's interesting that when alcoholics stop drinking, their fascination comes with food and preparing food and being like, that's kind of a thing for them.
Yes, that often happens, of course. Yeah, not always, but often. Yes, that certainly does happen. And it's very common. We talk a lot about cross addiction, right? When I speak with clients, it's sort of like, making them aware that it can be so that, when you've got one addiction, is there another outlet for the addiction, right? What else is there? Is there food? Is there drugs? Is there alcohol? Is there gambling? Oftentimes when we see that there is an addictive behavior, we realize, oh, there's not just one, there's actually quite a few of them, right? But it doesn't become so apparent until it becomes an issue, sort of, Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's so right. So, I mean, are there any practical tips or strategies that I mean, I know it's so different for everyone. So I know this is going to be a tricky question, me even asking you this, but for someone listening today that can put themselves thinking, yeah, I do struggle with food addiction. Is there one tip or something practical that we could give someone today?
Yeah, of course. So it depends on how distressing it is for you, right? If there is somebody who's listening, they're like, oh, I wish I was just making better choices. I think, I'm not doing so great with the food, but it's all right. I would say, well, just see if you can move towards healthier choices. And this is probably not rocket science, right? It's very much like, well, can I replace my my piece of cake with some fresh fruit or something, right? So that would be a very obvious kind of thing or strategy to change, right? Just minimize your exposure to this ultra processed food and see if you can replace it with more real food, just fresh vegetables, fruit, whatever, meat, fish, tofu, whatever. And so that's one thing. But if it's really getting to you, if it's quite acute and distressing, then I would say you must seek help, and one of the things that you can do is educate yourself. You'll actually find that nowadays, thank goodness, because when I first recovered, there wasn't many resources. Now there's quite a lot of resources, so you can educate yourself. There are several books, but one I'll mention is by a dear teacher and colleague, Dr. Vera Tarman. She's written a book called Food Junkies. And they've also got a podcast that is essentially the living continuation of that book. And it's a great way of educating yourself on all things food addiction. And what that does is it helps you understand this is a thing. There are many people who are struggling with this. It's real. So it validates your experience. It takes away the shame. And it just helps you to understand what's actually going on in your brain, in your body, in your biology, in your psychology. And that then makes change a lot easier as well, right? It's the first step. So I would say take the first step and educate yourself through those types of resources. And then again, I would also say, if you're feeling really distressed, do not go it alone, but seek counselling, right? Because you don't want to do this on your own. It's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to break an addiction like that on your own.
And that's why seeing a counsellor, when you find the right one, is really helpful, because obviously there's shame and there's embarrassment, and by knowing you're talking to someone that is got a duty of care to make sure that everything you say is kept private and confidential, and what better way of speaking to someone that's been through it. So one thing too that I learned when I was studying nutrition was this concept, which you did touch on, was overcrowding, and they talk about that. So overcrowding any meal you have with everything that we all know, and that's why we meat, vegetables, fruit, the stuff that's in the middle of the supermarket, like the outside of the supermarket. So your meat, your fruit, your vegetables, go around the outside type of thing. Yeah. Because the more that you have, and a lot of the time too, it's just simply that we're indoors a lot, so we don't have much vitamin D anymore. So sometimes it can be a deficient in nutrients, you need a bit more vitamin D, and vitamin D is a knock on to magnesium and to your fats for your brain. So food addiction there's so many different levels. It's not just there's something wrong. There's nothing wrong with you. There's different things at play.
Absolutely. And that's where nutritional education is really important too, right? Because many people know a lot about nutrition that come to me and they say, I know everything, but I can't stick to it. I can't implement it, right? So that's normally what I sort of get from clients. But other times there are people who just don't really know that they're making, unhealthy choices because everybody else is doing it and they're sort of just not really thinking about it. So there's that as well. And so for that, the education piece is incredibly important too, in terms of, what is nutrition and how can I make some really simple changes?
Thank you, because you just said something and just literally it's gone in one ear. It was so good. So good that my brain doesn't want me to remember it. You said something about you being surrounded by people and it's normal when people are doing it, so you're doing it. But one thing I do want to highlight, interested to see if you've seen this through your clinic, is there's been a really big push in the fitness industry at the moment to educate people about to lose weight. The only way is to lose weight is through a calorie deficit. So then when you look at someone's eating in a calorie deficit, I'm not food shaming, like, look, I'm not perfect, so please don't hear me when I say this. I'm just saying it from a awareness point. What's been marketed is, you can have the teaspoon or the tablespoon of Biscoff in your oats, and you can have the chocolate still with this, but there's some of us that can't have that. And I know I'm someone like that. If I was to eat in a calorie deficit and I included the processed foods in with my other foods, again, if I'm having a tablespoon of Biscoff, again, you better believe Barbara's going to eat the whole thing within, it might not be that day, but within I'll be generous here, within 2 or 3 days, it will be gone.
100%. So this is again where we, talk about the, abstaining from, ideally, for some people, abstaining really is the answer. And I would also speak to the whole calorie thing, right? And I wouldn't even in my practice, right? It's not really so much about weight loss or it's and I because I'm not a nutritionist or a dietitian, I don't really tell people what to eat, but usually I sort of help them work it out, right? In terms of most people come already and they know, right? It's just about how do I basically is always the question, the sort of the practical things about how do I change my addictive behaviors kind of thing, right? But so I don't really sort of tell people to count calories or any such thing, even though many people sort of want to, because I think that's another sort of obsession almost, right? And so the ideal really is that we just eat healthily and plentiful, and then we don't need to worry about counting calories or any such thing. It just becomes in an ideal world, we just then have a balanced way of eating, right?
Yeah, exactly. What advice would you give to parents that are listening to this to help their children? When I say children, it can be little ones, it can be adult children. So what advice would you give to parents to help their children develop healthy eating habits?
Oh, this is such a hard one. I don't have children, and I really do not envy parents in this day and age. And I think not only about food, but I think about social media as well. How much should you be able to expose a young person with a developing brain to, either whether it's ultra processed food or social media or any of those other things. It's very difficult. I think, first of all, is lead by example, in terms of what you eat, what you bring into the house. And also sort of, making it kind of fun and interesting. You can do a lot of cool stuff with natural food, like real food, right? It doesn't have to be ultra processed. And the other thing is, I think it for parents, it almost turns into a social justice issue, right? It's like campaigning, and I see this happening here and there, right? Clients who are like, they're beginning to campaign with their kids' schools about, healthier options to eat at the schools, to have available. And, slowly, we need to change the culture so that it actually becomes cool to abstain from the likes of sugar, or ultra processed stuff, as opposed to uncool, because at the moment it's still pretty much uncool. So if you don't partake, you're excluded. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something wrong with you, or parents are like, oh, it's interesting because a lot of people will say, oh, what are you eating? Well, that's not normal food, where most people, when they make a healthier choice, it is normal food, real food, but it's people's comments like, oh, yuck, that's not normal, or why are you worrying about that? Like, if it wasn't healthy for us, it wouldn't be on the shelves.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? This reminds me of a comment somebody made at that conference that I talked about earlier, right? There was that International Consensus Conference on Food Addiction in London a few weeks ago, and I was online, and I listened to all the lectures and talks, and it was fascinating. Somebody, I can't remember who it was, but somebody said, nowadays you've got to go outside to smoke. How funny would it be if you've got to go outside one day to have a dessert, right? I mean, I don't want to demonize desserts, of course, right? It's nice to have desserts or whatever, right? But for people who are struggling with this, and increasingly we are struggling with these types of, ultra processed types of desserts, it would be interesting to really treat it as a drug, because that's what it is. It's a drug. Yeah.
You know what? I am concerned because you look at smoking, but now there's vaping.
Oh, yeah. Mm.
People do that inside. So I'm wondering, like, when I was a kid, if anyone's from the 80s, or there was a cartoon called The Jetsons, which was like a cartoon about being in the future, and you fly in spaceships and they have meals, and the meal is just a tablet, and you press a button, the tablet comes on the plate, you eat the tablet, and the tablet gives you, it's kind of like space food, like it will give you, oh, I've just eaten the tablet, but I've tasted like a whole roast beef meal. And it's interesting to see, like, in the future, where is our food going to go? And if smoking is an example of, okay, now it's bad for you, but now it's been replaced with vaping and you can do it inside. I'm just curious to know what our future holds, where, yes, more people become, like the food industry especially, oh my God, everyone knows what we're trying to do. Let's try and mask it in a different way. So I'm really curious to know the cereal game, the muesli bar game, all that stuff. Where is it going to go?
Such an interesting question. And, I think it's not limited to food. I think humans are always going to find a way to create hits for themselves, right? Dopamine hits. And so, in all sorts of ways. And I think, even the health and wellness industry nowadays, right? Like you can get a real hit from just doing all sorts of wellness activities too, right? So we find new ways to become addicted, no doubt. And I think what that shows, and I think Anna Lemke talks about this, and also Gabor Mate, he's got a book. I can't remember if it's The New Normal or something. But anyway, both of them, they talk a lot about addiction in today's society. And what they both say in different words is essentially, what is the reason, the underlying reason for this condition of needing to escape so much, right? And this is the depth of it. And this is where I love, the psychotherapy around addiction, which I offer to clients, because it's sort of like, there are some there is the brain chemistry, of course, but there are some underlying emotional issues as well. And so what is that on a societal level, right? And so this is why we always want to do something addicting. It's so common, right? We want to escape from day-to-day reality.
And as you said, avoid pain to seek pleasure. But obviously, if we boil that down, as therapists, we see a lot of people that don't feel like they're good enough. So a lot of the time, the food addictions and things that we do boil down to, I'm not feeling good enough, so I'm going to sabotage myself to make sure that I'll never be good enough. Or it's that kind of beating yourself up, but in a different way.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of not enoughness, right? Whether it's I'm not good enough, or whether it's I don't have enough, or there won't be enough, right? There's definitely a lot of not enough. So that's certainly something that is very, very prevalent in the world of addiction. Absolutely. Yeah. Lots of different shades of not enough.
Yeah, definitely. This rat bag I'm just showing my puppy
Beautiful.
to Vanessa. I just telling everyone knows that's been listening to me for a while knows I have an 8-month-old puppy, and I just had to run because I thought that she was choking on something. And
Oh,
that's why I just quickly ran, because a noise, I hadn't heard the noise before. And do you want to tell everyone what you were doing? You found a sock, and then she was like eating a sock. So that's why I
I
had to.
see. Oh my goodness.
So this little rat
Oh.
bag is Tully. Before we wrap up, is there anything with all your experience and everything you see on a daily basis and your own personal journeys, or anything that you want to share with anyone listening today that you think that they might want to know or need to know?
Mm. I suppose I want to speak for, having compassion with yourself. I am very passionate about this type of therapy called internal family systems therapy, which is very much about self-compassion and learning about all of the different parts of us that play a role in our addictive process. And so I just want to say, be compassionate with yourself and all of the parts involved, and know that, there is always a positive intention behind any behavior that a person does, right? So even if you find yourself binging really, really hard and it seems like, oh my goodness, why am I doing this to myself? There is a positive intention behind it, and it's worth, I'm pondering that, right? And doing a little bit of inner work to get behind that, and know also that you're not alone.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's almost just being aware and knowing, okay, I do this, beating myself up isn't going to help. The
Absolutely.
whole eating and beating yourself up would almost be so habitual. So that's the thing, is when we first start these patterns of behavior, and like you said, you start the patterns of behavior, and then the more you get hooked or addicted, or you don't get the same hit, you, instead of one bag, you have 2 bags. Instead of one bottle of Coke, you have 8 bottles of Coca-Cola. And then by the time that happens, I think part of it is so automatic pilot, is so just, I eat this, and then that's why it's called a cycle. Like, I feel this way, then I'm going to beat myself up, then I'm going to bargain with myself, and then I'm going to repeat that pattern. And then over time, our self-esteem, our self-worth, and our self-confidence, because most of the time it's done with no one knows. No one knows about it. And even if we do talk about it, we're never really on it. Like, oh, yeah, I do this, but we're never honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
We're never honest with other people. And it's a really, I think, really tough place to be.
Absolutely. The other thing I would say is what helped me in the very early days in my recovery, when I first sort of sought help, is I went to some 12-step programs, one of them being Overeaters Anonymous. And what helped me in the beginning, when I was a little shy and I didn't want to go to the meetings, was just going to their website and listening to some of the audios that they've got there, where people are sharing their personal stories. Because that has always helped me, is listening to other people's personal stories, because again, it removes the shame. It makes me identify with, oh my goodness, they're doing that too. The crazy things that I've done with food, and hearing that other people have done them too, is massively liberating, because it's like, wow, I finally know that I'm not alone, and that this is actually a thing. So, that's another thing to explore, is just listening to other people's experience of addiction and recovery.
There's a lot of power in that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You really don't feel like you're alone when you hear someone else's story. And
Absolutely.
and it's interesting, because you feel so much compassion for that other person before we feel compassion for ourselves.
Yeah.
So when you hear someone sharing a story, you go, oh my God, wow, they're brave, they're being vulnerable. Wow, I really feel for them. And I send them so much love. But then it's great, but we need to be sending that back to ourselves too.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's
What a great, I know that you and I could talk literally
right.
for a really long time on this. And I think, we will talk at another stage on the episode, because this when people click on this and see the word food addiction, they're going to be like, yep, I need to know more. So if anyone is listening to this and they're like, yes, I would like to reach out for help and talk to someone that specializes in this, where is the best place for someone to book a session with you or get a hold of you?
Through my website. So my website is easy. It's just my name, vanessakredler.com, and you can find me there. And you'll find everything that I offer, from one-on-one sessions. Sometimes I do groups as well related to internal family systems. I've got a couple of courses on my website. So yes, please reach out if you'd like. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your time today and for sharing, being vulnerable and sharing, and also gifting us with showing us the way when it comes to eating and being addicted to food. Like, it's really nice to have someone that can show us the way and to show us that life, there is a life after this. You know, you can live a life with food and have a healthy relationship with food and not let it rule your life.
100%, absolutely. And thank you again for having me and for doing this podcast and, connecting different practitioners around the country and beyond. That's really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I hope this conversation has added value to your self-care journey and inspired positive changes in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with a friend who might benefit from this episode. Don't forget to subscribe on Spotify or on your favourite podcast platform to stay up to date on future episodes. Your support means the world to me. I genuinely love hearing from you, so please take a moment to leave a review. Let me know which part of today's episode resonated with you the most. Your feedback guides the direction of this podcast, and I really appreciate each and every single one of you for being a part of this community. To fall in love with yourself is the first secret to happiness. To find out a bit more about the Studio Chat podcast, head over to my Instagram page, Studio Chat Podcast, or if you want to find out a bit more about my counselling private practice, head over to Instagram on self_care_studio. Or head over to my website, selfcarebybarbarathompson.com.au. I'm really looking forward to seeing you on the next episode. Until next time, take care of yourselves and keep embracing the journey of self-discovery.